Hello, this is Minder Chen. I'm professor of Management Information System at Smith School of Business and Economics at CSU Channel Island. As you can see here, that I use an iceberg to model various elements of organizational cultures. Some are visible and a lot of them are invisible. So this is actually very important for us to try to get a grasp on organizational culture, which is a major challenge. And under our POLC framework, we can find the fostering of organizational culture under organizing category. But at the same time, leader has major responsibility in fostering organizational culture as well, which is part of the providing leaderships. Our learning objectives are describe what organizational culture is and why it is important for an organization to have a appropriate culture, or sometimes even a strong culture. We need to understand the dimension that make up an organizational cultures and understand the process of creating and maintaining organizational culture. We also need to understand the factor that create culture change. We'll also discuss something we call the organizational culture profile, and then use that profile to introduce a concept called person-organization fit. Let me give you a short definition of mine regarding culture. Culture is defined as a set of behaviors and values that are learned and shared by a group of people. The group here could be a team, which will become a so-called team cultures, could be a company, an organization, that's the organizational culture, and certainly can be as big as the national culture. Different countries, nations has its own history and heritage, and when you travel around the globe, you will find actually culture differences, and that's important in the increasing globalized business environment. A more elaborate definition is the following. Culture is the belief, customs, artifacts, etc. of a particular society group in a certain place or a certain time. We add the time element just because culture certainly evolve and may change. So even, let's say, the American cultures in the 60s is certainly different from the culture that we have now. And the IBM 30 years ago certainly is quite different than the IBM at this time. This is the Webster's dictionary's definitions. From our textbook, the definition is organizational culture is a system of shared assumptions, value, belief that indicate appropriate and inappropriate behavior within a given organization, which means that organizational culture somehow govern how we behave. Edgar Schein, who is an expert in organizational culture, I believe he is a professor at MIT. He argued the most intriguing aspect of culture is that most of them are invisible, which means below the surface. Remember, we used the iceberg as an analogy to describe culture. However, cultures are powerful in their impact, but invisible, and to considerable extent unconscious, which means that people who live and work in an organization may not be aware of its own cultures. So culture is to a group or to an organization is just like personality or character that is to an individual. So I guess we can state the following, which means organizational culture is just like the personality of the organizations, and which people within or even outside the organization may somehow recognize. And certainly we can see the behavior side of what manifests from the cultures, and however, we cannot see the force, which is an invisible part of the culture underneath the iceberg that cause certain kind of behavior. So behavior is more the visible part, and then the forces underneath the surface, such as assumptions, etc., can be difficult for people to understand. And culture, just like personality and character guide some of our behavior, organizational culture guides and constrains the behavior of the member of the group through a shared norm that are held in that group. So if we simplified different layer of cultures from the innermost to the outermost, we have assumptions, and we have value, the core value, remember, and then that actually is driving us for certain behavior or guiding us for certain behavior, good or bad, and eventually that behavior certainly will contribute to the result in terms of performance of the organizations. So culture often reflects how people do things within an organization. A lot of time, if you asked somebody in the organization why they do certain thing, the answer is, this is how we do things around here. They really don't have a good explanation, and there's no formal rules, no formal policy, but it's really the culture that has been fostered, cultivated for a long time, that actually shape the way they behave. Behind it, it's really the assumption and value. In a study by Economist Intelligence Unit stated that 56% of the US executives felt the single greatest obstacle to growth was corporate cultures. So culture certainly is a very important aspect of an organization that we need to reckon with, and we have to deal with, and if possible, we need to manage and then shape the culture the way we want it, but it's not an easy job. We mentioned there are different layers of organizational culture, from the innermost layer, which is assumption, and then the values, and eventually the artifact or the behaviors. We'll describe the artifact could be just even our logo or our building could be considered the artifact that reflect our culture underneath that the surface of the iceberg. And most of the organizational culture are invisible, but we can actually get some clue from the visible artifact, as we have shown here. The research regarding organizational culture started relatively late, started around in the 70s. So although it has been for about 50 years now, but it's really a top topic, an important topic, which wasn't really studied in the early first half of the 20th century. The artifacts that we mentioned could be workplace layout, the building. It could be mission and visions. It could be the organizational chart, organizational structures, or even how people wear to work. Some organization you have to wear very formally, like in the bank. A lot of IBMer tends to wear quite formally. But like in CI, as a faculty member, we dress pretty casually. But if you're a faculty member at Harvard Business School, you wear a bow tie, believe it or not, in most of the case. We did mention the culture iceberg, or the iceberg model for organizational cultures. This is just a little conversation from the Analect, which we used once before. A student of Confucius, which is the master's, wanted to do away with a sacrificial ship. And at the announcement of the new moon, which means there's a tradition that at the beginning of the new moon on that day every month, then they will have a sheep that sacrifice as a ceremony. But most of people don't pay too much attention to it. And Zigong, which is a student of Confucius, is like, a business has great business sense, basically just say, since nobody pay attention, we should get rid of it. But the Confucius say the following. Ci actually is Zigong's name. You are concerned about the cost of the ship, but I'm afraid of the disappearance of the rite of the ritual, as I mentioned here. Confucius didn't say much, but I added to explain, I believe, what he really meant, because Confucius really believed some of the ritual, symbol, language, logo doesn't seem to mean much, but in reality, they're really reflecting what's beneath the iceberg. And as long as you have that ritual, people who are serious about the culture of organization will trace back to the history what those ritual really means, and eventually find out the true meaning and value, or even the assumption from those rituals. If you get rid of some of the ritual, then some of the hidden invisible value assumption may be lost forever. So this two layer, invisible and visible layer, they kind of play out, they support each other. So they're all important. We shouldn't ignore the visible portion of the culture. And at the same time, we need to understand there's important elements of culture that are invisible. Here's just another diagram showing the iceberg model of organizational cultures, just for your interest. You can follow the link and get hold of this more complicated version of the iceberg model for culture. Let's look at obviously a very visible artifacts of cultures, which is the physical layout, the buildings, the public displacement, and object. Can you guess what company this may be? You may be considered Disney, Pixar, but in reality, here's the answers. It is Google, okay? And the question is, how could this influence the organizational cultures? At Google, they try to promote creativity and the fun atmospheres by enhancing their building with a vast array of visual stimuli. This is just an example. You can actually search the web, like Google Office Space, and you will find a lot of interesting office design. And one thing I do want to mention, this is not just at Google, but at Pixar, or maybe the new Apple's headquarters. They try to stimulate innovation via the design of the office space to create the so-called chance encounters. so they actually design a lot of ad hoc meeting places. For instance, even at the Sage Hall, which is our business schools located, we do have kitchens, two kitchen actually. A lot of time you bump into colleagues, sometimes from different areas, and then you chat with them, and then sometimes you get great idea by talking to them, and instead of staying in your own office or cubicle, this kitchen, water cooler areas could be a great place to have that chance encounter, particularly with people from different disciplines. At Sage Hall, we actually used to have history professors, sociology professors, but now they moved to some new buildings, so I really missed the chance to talk to them. And they are so-called multiple culture within an organization. Sometimes a particular department, even a team, or a geographical location of a unit may have their own subculture. So this means that some groups of organization may have different assumptions or values than the mainstream organizations. I'll just use Apple as an example. The design group in Apple probably are very innovative and creative at their headquarters. They're very secretive as well. However, if you work at Apple Store in Thousand Oak, then you probably will experience quite a different culture, although you all work for Apple, Apple Inc. But since you work at different departments and units, they certainly have different culture. There are some shared portion of the culture in Apple that you all share, but there's definitely major differences in this case. And sometimes a subculture may take a form of counterculture. The counterculture means counter the mainstream organization's cultures. And let me give you just an example. This is actually a picture of Steve Jobs with some of his Macintosh team member. And a lot of the team member are musicians, poets, but they happen to be great programmers. So they come from different backgrounds, and Steve Jobs recruit them from inside Apple to have a separate building. They actually raise pirate flags on top of the building. It's totally different than other part of the Apple. This was in I think late 70s or 1970 or the early 80s. And their slogan for recruiting even internally, is it's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy. Navy may not like the slogan, but that's how they try to recruit people. And this definitely is a culture that's unique. It's maybe even a counterculture within Apple at the time. And this brings to Richard Florida's books called The Rise of the Creative Class, published in 2002. He believed that he studied regional economics. He found that in region that tends to be very creative, innovative, tends to have the talent, the technology, and the third T is tolerance. He found that have tolerance of different ideas, different personality, people with different background is a very important attribute for an organization or for regions to have very creative, innovative cultures. And he believed that talented people seek an environment that open to differences. This was a commercial put out by Apple's probably in around 1997. This is when Steve Jobs had the second coming. He was forced out around 1985. And around 10, 11 years later, he was recruited eventually back to Apple, first as a consultant, then eventually became the CEO again. It's a wonderfully made commercial. You can easily find this called Think Different. And I found a special version that was read by Steve Jobs. The official commercial version was read by someone else. So I'm not going to read this for you. Steve actually read it beautifully. This version was first released at the ceremony in memory of Steve Jobs at Apple's headquarters. But you can see some of the counterculture's keywords: crazy one, misfit, rebels, troublemakers, etc. Definitely, it's a counterculture to which encourage people to overthrow the status quo, to be innovative. Once again, in Apple, you may think it's very creative, innovative. It's kind of have a more freedoms in terms of sharing idea. That's relatively true, but at the same time, Apple enforce actually the policy clearly that if you leak corporate company information or secret about future product to anybody, including journalists or analysts, you will get fired real quick. This in their orientation, they actually tell you this, and they take it seriously. In Steve Jobs' office, I read he had a poster which is from the Second World War II, in terms of alert us that they may be spied anywhere. What's written here is a loose lips might sink ships. Okay, this is from the World War II poster. A case in point. Apple's successful iPad product was actually initiated when Steve Jobs attended a party that also attended by Bill Gates from Microsoft. I think it's hosted by a Microsoft employee. It's a couple. And somehow they know Steve Jobs as well. And there's a guy at the party from Microsoft keep bragging about the tablet PC they were working on. When Steve Jobs heard about it, went back and eventually internally start a similar project for tablet computer that's a more successful iPad comparing to the tablet PC. Actually, I was the user of the first generation of tablet PC. I've been through 1, 2, 3, maybe the fourth tablet PC now. When I'm drawing here, really I'm using a tablet PC. It's very convenient. And so I'm fond of actually tablet PC from Microsoft, but at the same time, I do use iPad, and iPads, it's very easy to use and very reliable, knock on wood. Okay, I've been using my iPad 2, I believe, for many years now. And next is what we call dimensions of organizational culture profiled. There are 7 dimensions of cultures, and organization can have more or less of each dimensions, and this dimension are innovative, aggressive, outcome-oriented, stable, people-oriented, team-oriented, and detail-oriented. And here's kind of a brief definition for each one of them. So we may ask, why does organizational culture matter? And because organizational culture may be one of an organization's strongest asset, which is very difficult for other company to copy. For instance, Zappos service-oriented culture is one that's very difficult for somebody to imitate. When it's inimitable, even you want to be like Zappos, it can be difficult for you to imitate and then compete with it. However, it can be a liability if you have a culture which doesn't really guide you towards the direction you're heading to. Culture needs to be aligned with an organization's mission and vision, needs to be adapted to the opportunity and threat from the environment. If aligned, can be a strength in your SWOT analysis, but if it's misaligned, it can be a weakness in SWOT analysis. Organizational culture is an effective control mechanism, although it tends to be less visible, less formal. But however, it may guide your employee how they may behave. And because people do act on their assumption and value without even thinking about it, and sometimes social pressure, which is part of the culture, is a huge motivator of behavior. Let's use Southwest Airlines as an example to illustrate the use of organizational culture as a competitive advantage. And first, Southwest Airlines see the opportunity of the airline industry being deregulated. However, customers may not be happy, and so flying being delayed, lost luggage, and whatsoever. So they see this as an opportunity for them to compete. Southwest Airlines has built a reputation as a fun, lighthearted, and irreverent airline with happy staff. A good video that I found and have seen before is this. I encourage you to watch this video, and it's really short. It's a flight attendant rapping the safety instructions at Southwest Airlines. And the unique organizational culture for Southwest Airlines has become its competitive advantage. The smiling staff member can handle negative issues skillfully and still satisfy their customers. And however, try to maintain this unique cultures. Southwest, one of its biggest hiring criterion is whether an applicant smiled during or her interview. So smile. I think this is important, not just for Southwest. The smile gets you somewhere. Southwest feel it can train anyone to do the job, but it cannot teach a person to have a positive attitude. So be positive, be happy, but be sincere. And okay, so we will continue to discuss organizational culture when we come back for the second lecture on organizational culture. Thank you. Bye-bye.